I have read the files 3 times now. I will read them a 4th before I sign the reclassification form, because I want to be certain that what I am about to do is correct. Certainty, in my profession, is rare. In 41 years as a cataloging historian at the Bureau of Recovered Expeditions, I have handled 14,000 separate incident files, ranging from the mundane, a merchant convoy lost to a navigational error in the Sorvon Drift, to the extraordinary, the Thethi collapse, which consumed an entire transit corridor and stranded 11 species commercial traffic for a generation. I have signed reclassification forms before. I have written the word irrecoverable in the appropriate field with an archivist's steady hand, and felt nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of a file correctly closed. I do not think I will feel that satisfaction tonight. The subarchive is cold. The Bureau's ventilation system on this level has been malfunctioning for 3 years. I have submitted the repair request 4 times, and so the air here carries a damp chill that settles into old joints and makes the light seem thinner than it is. I keep a secondary lamp on my reading table for exactly this reason. It throws a circle of amber across the file spread before me. 5 dossiers, each one a different weight, each one containing the records of an expedition that set out with great purpose and returned not at all. Let me be precise, because precision is what I owe the record. The Bureau of Recovered Expeditions exists to catalog every enterprise that departed Velhari sovereign space and did not return on schedule, to gather whatever telemetry, relay transmissions, or secondary witness accounts can be assembled, and to render a final classification on what occurred. We are not judges. We are not military. We are not tasked with revenge or prevention. We are recorders of what was and what is no longer. Our classifications are: recovered asset or personnel returned, partially recovered some assets or personnel documented losses, lost to known causes, the file explains why, lost to unknown causes, the file cannot explain why, and irrecoverable, the inquiry cannot be usefully extended. Further expeditions are formally not recommended. That last classification requires a senior historian's signature and a secondary review, which is why these 5 files have been sitting in my subarchive since my predecessor retired 11 years ago. She left them without a note. She left them without a classification stamped. She left them neatly stacked and bound with archival cord, and the message their very neatness conveyed was the same one she apparently lacked either the courage or the language to write plainly. I am done with these. I cannot finish them. Someone else must. Someone else is me. I was promoted into this subarchive's oversight 18 months after she left, and for 9 years I have moved these 5 dossiers from one corner of my reading table to the other without opening them, because every time I looked at the archival cord I thought, not yet. There was always another file more urgent, always another inquiry with cleaner edges, and a resolution that did not require me to sit alone in a cold room reading transmissions from ships that stopped transmitting. But the Bureau's Oversight Council has noticed the gap. They have sent me a formal inquiry, their 3rd, asking for the status of Acquisition Series 7 through 11, which is the internal designation for the 5 dossiers spread before me now. I'm out of extensions. So I am here, at the end of a long Thursday, with my secondary lamp burning amber, and I am going to read them properly, and then I am going to write the word irrecoverable on 5 separate forms, and I am going to mean it. I will tell you what is in them. Not because you have standing to review these files, very few people do, but because I am a historian, and historians understand that an account which is never spoken aloud to another living mind is simply a list of data waiting to be lost. If the Bureau's ventilation system finally floods this subarchive, as I half expect it to do any year now, these files will be destroyed, and the record they contain will exist nowhere else, and something important will have gone quiet without even the courtesy of being heard once. So, Acquisition Series 7 through 11, 5 expeditions, 5 separate empires or coalitions or corporate governance structures, each operating independently, each unaware of the others at the time of their departure. None returned. The files note the departure dates, the last known positions, the final transmissions, and then, in each case, a blank. The blank is the story. Before I open the first dossier, I should explain what they were after, what they all went looking for. Because you cannot understand why 5 different civilizations sent acquisition fleets to the same region of space, across a span of roughly 200 years, without understanding what drew them there. The humans had built something. This is not a secret. It is more of a legend now, the kind of thing that circulates in academic xenobiology corridors and military intelligence briefings, and the quieter corners of trade summits where people speak carefully and look at their hands. But the core of it is documented, at least in outline, in the acquisition files themselves, because each expedition had done its research before departing, and each expedition's pre-departure intelligence summary was included in the dossier as a matter of protocol. What the humans had built, what they discovered to be more accurate, since invention and discovery are not always distinguishable at the frontier of knowledge, was a fusion, a joining, not a metaphor. A literal, physical, functional joining of 2 things that every other species in the explored galaxy had always treated as separate categories. Structured energy fields, what some of the older spacefaring civilizations had developed into hard light architectures, construction lattices, containment frameworks, and living biological matter. Every civilization that had worked with structured energy fields had encountered the same hard boundary. Energy lattices could be made precise, could be made powerful, could be made to hold tremendous loads or perform complex functions, but they were inert. They did not grow. They did not heal. They did not adapt to damage or change in response to their environment. They were machines made of light, and they behaved like machines, fixed in function, requiring constant maintenance and external direction, incapable of the self-correction that living tissue performs without being asked. And every civilization that had worked in biological medicine and biotechnology had encountered a different hard boundary in the opposite direction. Living tissue was adaptive, self-correcting, capable of astonishing growth and recovery, but it was slow, imprecise, fragile in certain ways, and above all fundamentally limited in the forces it could channel. You could not ask a living cell to act as a structural load-bearing element. You could not ask a vine or a neural filament to contain a reactor's output. The 2 domains were separated by what most xenobiology researchers had simply come to accept as a categorical fact of the universe. Life and force energy did not mix. The humans had made them mix. The acquisition files are careful not to overstate this, because the pre-departure intelligence was fragmentary. No one had actually seen the technology operating. What the intelligence services of the 5 expeditions had assembled were second-hand accounts. A Jurassic trade vessel crew who had docked briefly at a station on the outer margin of human-adjacent space and observed something growing along a habitat corridor wall that was simultaneously alive and structured with visible energy patterns. A Velhari merchant's report of having witnessed a human field medic treating wounds, not with instruments or compounds, but with what appeared to be articulated filaments of living plant matter threaded through with light, closing injuries in seconds rather than minutes. A recovered and partially deciphered fragment of a human research transmission that had been bouncing through a relay node for years before anyone thought to translate it, which contained what appeared to be mathematical notation, describing the binding interface between cellular biology and photonic energy lattices. Fragments, impressions, second-hand testimony, and a partially decoded signal. That was what drove 5 separate expeditions across 2 centuries. I understand the appeal. I am a historian, not a scientist, but I understand the appeal. If the fragments were accurate, if the humans had genuinely bridged the categorical divide between living matter and structured energy, Then they had produced something that would rewrite xenobiology, military medicine, construction, agriculture, and half a dozen other domains so completely that any empire holding the technique would be positioned ahead of every other civilization for the next 1,000 years. The strategic value was incalculable. The commercial value was more incalculable still. And humans, as a species, were known to be fiercely independent in how they shared what they made. Known, as well, to have complicated relationships with the large governance structures that sometimes tried to acquire their innovations through institutional pressure rather than negotiation. Hence the acquisition fleets, hence the 5 expeditions, hence the 5 dossiers. I opened the first one. Acquisition Series 7 is the oldest file in the stack, predating the others by nearly 60 years. The expedition belonged to the Sorethian Cooperative, a commercial governance structure that no longer exists, having dissolved through a combination of economic pressure and internal conflict about 20 years after this expedition's departure, which means there is no surviving institutional authority to notify of the file's final classification. I note this on my intake form. The Sorethian Cooperative sent what its own records called a procurement mission: 3 vessels, a primary negotiation ship, a scientific assessment vessel, and a security escort. The security escort is the detail I always notice in acquisition files. Institutions that send only negotiators bring negotiators. Institutions that also bring security have already decided what they will do if the negotiation fails. The pre-departure documentation is thorough and optimistic. The cooperative's assessment team had concluded that the human biotechnology, if it existed as described, represented a breakthrough of the first order, and that the humans who had developed it, a small research collective operating outside the major human institutional frameworks, would be susceptible to a sufficiently generous commercial offer, augmented if necessary by the kind of institutional pressure that comes when a governance structure considerably larger than yourself makes plain that it considers your cooperation to be in your own best interest. That phrase appears in the actual document, in your own best interest. The archivist in me reads it and feels something I do not have a clean word for, not quite contempt, not quite pity, a recognition, perhaps, that the Sorethian Cooperative's assessment team had made a very specific error. They had assumed that the humans who built something extraordinary would respond to the same pressures that governed everyone else's decisions. They had assumed that size and institutional weight and the implicit threat of being made uncomfortable would produce compliance. The first transmission from the procurement mission's primary vessel was logged 47 days after departure. It noted successful passage through the outer transit corridors and an ETA of 19 days to the target coordinates. The crew was in good health. The mission commander expressed confidence. The second transmission was logged 61 days after departure. It noted that they had reached the coordinates and were attempting to establish contact with the Human Research Collective. The contact protocols were proceeding normally. Some difficulty in locating the precise facility. The intelligence had given a regional estimate rather than a precise location, and the region was larger than the mission had anticipated. The third transmission was logged 68 days after departure. The mission commander's tone had changed. The facility had been located, but the initial contact had not gone as the pre-departure planning described. The humans were, in the commander's words, unmoved by the opening offer and unwilling to discuss institutional arrangements. The commander noted that they were proceeding to the second phase of the negotiation, which is the phrase the pre-departure documentation had used for the part involving the security escort. There was no fourth transmission. The Bureau logged the mission as overdue at day 93. At day 120, after no further signals and no secondary witness accounts from any vessel passing through the region, the file was opened as an active inquiry. The inquiry lasted 11 years, during which time the Bureau collected precisely nothing new. No wreckage was found. No crew members appeared at any station or port. No other vessel reported encountering the Sorethian mission, or any debris consistent with 3 ships of their class and configuration. The Sorethian Cooperative filed their own search, 2 vessels, which also did not return, and which generated a separate file that is cataloged under a different series number, and that I am not reviewing tonight. And then the Cooperative's own dissolution overtook the inquiry, and the file sat until it came to rest in this sub-archive. 3 ships and their crews, gone, no explanation recoverable. I close the first dossier and sit for a moment. The lamp makes no sound. The ventilation system makes its usual noise, which is the sound of air moving through channels that were not designed well and have been declining for years. I am very aware of being alone down here. I open the second dossier. Acquisition Series 8 belongs to the Kethavar Imperium, which still exists, one of the older continuous governance structures in this part of the explored galaxy, and a power that has not historically been gentle about acquiring things it decided it wanted. The Kethavar Imperium sent not a procurement mission, but an extraction fleet. The distinction is important and is not my word. It appears in their own pre-departure documentation. Extraction implies that the material to be obtained has already been identified, that the method of obtaining it has already been determined, and that the operation is essentially a logistics problem rather than a diplomatic one. 11 vessels, military class. A full extraction complement with specialists in technical retrieval, meaning people whose professional purpose is to identify, disable, package, and transport research installations and their contents, including their personnel. I will not editorialize. I'm an archivist. I note only that the Kethavar Imperium had, in the 60 years since the Sorethian mission failed to return, apparently concluded that what the Sorethian mission lacked was sufficient force, and had adjusted its approach accordingly. I will also note, because it belongs in the record, that the intelligence the Kethavar Imperium had assembled was considerably more detailed than the Sorethian cooperatives had been. 60 years of patient collection. More fragments. Better translations of intercepted transmissions. A clearer picture of where the human research collective operated, and this is the detail that clearly most excited the Kethavar intelligence analysts. Evidence that the biotechnology had developed substantially in the intervening decades. The fragments now suggested not merely an experimental fusion of life and structured energy, but a mature, functional system. Networks of living filaments that could be directed with precision, that could heal damaged tissue in real time with a speed and completeness no other known technique approached, that could be woven through structural materials to produce self-repairing architectures, that could, in the more speculative assessments, be used to interface directly between living neural systems and energy-based computational structures in ways that had been theorized for centuries but never achieved. The Kethavar Intelligence Summary described this as a technology of the first rank. They used that phrase, first rank, meaning of a kind that changes the balance of capability so completely that possession by one party and absence in all others constitutes a strategic rupture. They sent 11 warships to take it. The extraction fleet's first transmission was logged 39 days after departure. Standard transit update. No notable events. The second transmission was logged 52 days after departure. The fleet had reached the outer approach to the target region and was conducting a final survey before beginning the extraction operation. The fleet commander, a Kethavar officer named in the file by rank and designation, though I will not repeat either here, noted that the survey had revealed human activity in the region consistent with the intelligence profile. He expressed satisfaction. The third transmission was logged 55 days after departure, 3 days after the previous one. The commander noted that they had made initial contact with the Human Research Collective and issued formal notice of the extraction order. He reported that the response from the humans had been, and here the document uses a Kethavar institutional term that translates imperfectly as something between dismissal and a complete absence of concern. Not defiance, not hostility. Simply an apparent indifference to the extraction order and to the presence of 11 warships making it. The commander found this puzzling. He said so. He noted that he intended to proceed with the operation regardless. The fourth transmission was logged 57 days after departure, 2 days after the third. This transmission is the shortest of the four. It contains some technical data, positional coordinates, a status designation, and then a single sentence from the commander that the Bureau's translation team rendered as, "They are not what we believe them to be, and I am not certain we are going to be able to." The transmission ends there, mid-sentence. Not with a break in signal, the carrier wave continued for several minutes after the final words, which the Bureau's technical analysis team noted suggested the transmission had not been disrupted, but simply stopped being composed. The speaker had stopped speaking. No fifth transmission, no further contact, 11 warships in their full complements, gone. The Kethavar Imperium conducted its own response, which generated a separate series of files I'm also not reviewing tonight. I know enough about those files to know that the Kethavar response did not produce any additional information about the fate of the extraction fleet, and that the Kethavar Imperium subsequently, and very quietly reclassified the entire region of space, containing the Human Research Collective's operating area as a restricted approach zone. They did not publicize this reclassification. They did not explain it to the other galactic powers. They simply reissued their navigational charts with a small notation in the relevant sector that their own translators would render to a Velhari reader as something in the general neighborhood of, "Vessels are not encouraged to approach this area." I have the revised Kethavar chart in the dossier. I have looked at the notation many times. It is very small. It is written in the clinical language of bureaucratic navigational guidance, and it communicates absolute terror with perfect efficiency. I close the second dossier. The third dossier is thinner than the others. Acquisition Series 9 belongs to the Arvith Consensus, which was a governance structure formed by a coalition of 7 smaller species who had pooled their resources and institutional capability in order to compete with the larger single-species empires in various commercial and scientific domains. The Arvith Consensus, unlike the Sorethian Cooperative and the Kethavar Imperium, had not attempted to simply take the human biotechnology. They had attempted to cultivate a relationship. This took time. The consensus had reached out through intermediaries, a series of trading vessels and commercial liaisons who had existing relationships in the regions adjacent to human space. They had spent years building a picture of the Human Research Collective through indirect channels, what the humans valued, what they had rejected before, what kind of engagement they found tolerable, and what kind they did not. They had apparently learned from the records of the Sorethian and Kethavar attempts, though the consensus's pre-departure documentation does not say so explicitly. It says only that the mission was designed to be different in character from previous approaches by other parties, which is the careful institutional language of people who know their predecessors failed and are trying not to say so in a document that will be archived. The Arvith Consensus sent 4 vessels, no military complement. Scientists, cultural liaisons, and what their own documentation called engagement specialists, people trained in cross-species negotiation, in reading what another civilization considers an acceptable opening, in building trust across the categorical gaps between different kinds of minds. Their first transmissions are extraordinary to read, detailed, optimistic, careful. The engagement team reported that they had made contact with the Human Research Collective, not the same individuals the Kethavar Imperium had confronted a generation earlier, since time had passed and the people had changed, but the same lineage of work, the same ongoing project, now mature in ways the earlier intelligence had only guessed at. The consensus team reported that the humans had received them. Not warmly, exactly. The engagement specialists noted with professional honesty that the humans were watching them very carefully, the way any people who have had their home approached by force twice in living memory watch anyone who comes a third time, but without hostility. The Arvith consensus's engagement proceeded for months. The file contains transmission logs of genuine intellectual exchange, the consensus scientists and the human researchers discussing, in general terms, the theoretical frameworks underlying the biotechnology. Nothing detailed enough to constitute a transfer of knowledge, but conversation. Real conversation, of the kind that suggested the humans were at least willing to think about what it might mean to share something, on their own terms, in their own time. The engagement specialists reported that progress was slow but real. Then the Arvith consensus's governing council made a decision. The file contains the council's directive. It is the kind of directive that people make when they have been patient for a long time and have grown impatient with their own patience. The council noted that the engagement had been ongoing for 11 months, that no concrete agreement on knowledge transfer had been reached, and that the consensus's strategic situation had changed in ways that made the acquisition of the human biotechnology more urgently necessary than it had been at the mission's inception. They directed the mission to accelerate the timeline for reaching a formal transfer agreement. The engagement specialists, to their credit, responded with a transmission that is one of the most carefully worded documents in the entire file. They explained, with great diplomatic precision, that the relationship being built with the Human Research Collective was not of a kind that could be accelerated without being destroyed. They used the word destroyed. They recommended strongly against the Council's directive. The Council's response directed the mission to proceed with the accelerated timeline. The engagement specialists sent one more transmission to the Council. It was much shorter than the previous ones. It said, in full, "We will follow your directive. We are very sorry." The next transmission in the file is from the engagement mission's primary vessel. It is a distress signal. Automated format, the kind that fires when a ship's crew initiates an emergency evacuation protocol, or when the onboard systems detect conditions severe enough to trigger the beacon without crew, direction. The Arvith consensus logged the distress signal on receipt and dispatched 2 search vessels. The search vessels found nothing, no wreckage, no crew. The consensus filed an inquiry that ran for 6 years and produced no new information. What happened in the months of genuine, careful conversation that the Arvith consensus's engagement team spent with the Human Research Collective? What the humans and those particular consensus scientists actually said to each other? What was learned? What understanding passed between them, if any did? None of that is in the file. None of it was transmitted back. The engagement specialists apparently judged their work too sensitive to relay home in real time, which was probably a sound professional instinct, and which means that whatever they learned died with them. I sit with that for a while. The ventilation system hums. The lamp burns. The third dossier is thin because the records of real engagement, of something that might have been different, were carried in the minds of people who did not come back. I open the 4th dossier. Acquisition Series 10. The Velhari Directorate, which exists today as a significantly smaller governance structure than it was at the time of this expedition. The reduction in its scope and institutional capacity is not directly attributable to the loss of this expedition. The Directorate had several compounding difficulties in the period that followed, but the file notes, in a footnote appended by a previous Bureau historian, that the Velhari Directorate's Strategic Planning Division suffered a serious loss of confidence and internal credibility in the years after this expedition's failure, and that this may have contributed to broader institutional erosion. I credit that footnote without endorsing its speculative elements. The Velhari Directorate had taken a different approach than all three of its predecessors. It had studied the failures. This is documented. The Directorate's pre-departure assessment contains a genuine historical analysis of what had gone wrong for the Sorethian Cooperative, the Kethavar Imperium, and the Archivist Consensus. The Sorethian mission had underestimated the humans' resistance and had brought insufficient force while also bringing too much implied threat. The Kethavar mission had brought overwhelming force and had apparently encountered something that force could not resolve. The Archivist mission had built a genuine relationship and had then destroyed it by subordinating the relationship to institutional impatience. The Directorate's analysts concluded, with what I have to acknowledge is reasonable rigor, that the central problem across all three failures was a mismatch between the methods applied and the nature of what was being sought. You cannot coerce a people who are not afraid of your coercion. You cannot build trust and then weaponize it without destroying both the trust and yourself. You cannot send warships to negotiate and expect the other party to believe you are negotiating. Their proposed solution was elegant in concept. They would not negotiate. They would not extract. They would not attempt to build trust and then abuse it. They would instead insert a small team, 4 individuals, traveling in a single vessel of no military character whatsoever, who would present themselves not as representatives of the Directorate at all, but as independent researchers with a genuine scientific interest in the intersection of biological systems and energy architectures. They would spend time in the region. They would learn. They would, over time and with great patience, either find a way to acquire the knowledge directly through relationship, or, if relationship proved impossible, document enough about what they observed to allow the Directorate's own researchers to reconstruct the core principles independently. The plan was in its own terms sophisticated: 4 people, 1 vessel. No flags, no insignia, no stated institutional affiliation. A long timeline. The pre-departure documentation budgeted 3 standard years for the mission. The first transmission, 18 months into the mission, reported that the team had established a presence in the human-adjacent region and were making careful progress. The team leader, described only by a professional designation in the file, noted that the humans were complex in ways the pre-departure briefing had not fully captured, that they were watching for exactly the kind of approach the Directorate had designed, that the cover was being maintained, but was under constant quiet pressure from the scrutiny of the people they were trying to observe. The team leader recommended extending the timeline by a year. The second transmission, 22 months in, reported a significant development. The team had been made. The humans knew who they were and who had sent them. The team leader did not know how the cover had been maintained with care, but the knowledge was evident in how the humans now treated the team's presence in the region. Not with hostility, with a kind of deliberate, patient transparency that the team leader described as more unsettling than hostility would have been. The humans knew the Directorate's people were watching, and they were letting them watch, and they were not afraid. The team leader asked for new instructions. The Directorate's response directed the team to maintain their position and continue their work by any means available. The third and final transmission from the team came 8 days after the Directorate's response. It was addressed not to the Directorate's Strategic Planning Division, but to the Bureau of Recovered Expeditions directly. This is unusual. The Bureau does not typically receive mid-mission transmissions from expeditions that have not yet been classified as overdue. The team leader apparently knew they were going to be overdue before the Bureau did. The transmission read in full as the Bureau's translation team rendered it, to the Bureau of Recovered Expeditions. We are filing this transmission directly because we do not believe our next report will reach the Directorate. We are not in danger at this moment. We want to be clear about that. The humans have not threatened us or harmed us. But we have reached an understanding with them that we cannot explain to our institutional supervisors, and we have made a choice that our supervisors would classify as a mission failure. We are choosing not to return. The knowledge the directorate sent us to acquire is not ours to take. The people who built it are not what we were told they were, and what they have built is not what we were told it was, and we no longer believe that taking it was ever the right purpose for this mission. We are sorry for the trouble this will cause the Bureau. We are not sorry for the choice. File this as you see fit. The transmission ends there. The Bureau filed it. The Directorate conducted an inquiry that lasted 3 years and produced no additional contact with the team and no information about their location or status. The team was eventually classified by the Directorate as lost to unknown causes. The Bureau opened its own inquiry, which ran concurrently, and also produced no new information. 4 people who chose not to come back, their reasons stated clearly to the extent they could state them. The knowledge they went to acquire, not taken. I close the 4th dossier and sit for longer this time. The subarchive is very quiet. At some point while I was reading the 3rd dossier, the ventilation system went through one of its occasional pauses, the intermittent failure that the maintenance request has never resolved. And in the silence, I can hear my own breathing and the faint creak of the building's structural members adjusting to the cooler night temperature outside. This building was constructed before I was born. It has housed the Bureau's records for longer than most of the civilizations represented in these 5 files have existed in their current form. There is something both comforting and oppressive about that. The records persist. The institutions that generated them do not always. The thing the team leader said, that what the humans had built was not what they were told it was, that the people who built it were not what they were told they were, these words appear in different forms in multiple places across the 5 files. The Kethavar commander's last transmission. They are not what we believed them to be. The Arvith engagement specialists. We will follow your directive. We are very sorry. Now the Mevsathari team leader. The knowledge is not ours to take. I want to sit with the Mevsathari transmission for a moment longer before I move to the 5th dossier, because I think it is the most important document in this entire stack, and I think it has been mostly ignored by the Bureau historians who reviewed these files before me, probably because it is anomalous. It does not fit the pattern of the other files. The other files are records of failure ships that stopped transmitting, crews that vanished, inquiries that produced nothing. The 4th dossier is the record of a different kind of outcome, one that the Bureau's classification system does not have a good category for. 4 people who knew the classification system, who addressed their final transmission directly to the Bureau, who chose the outcome they were going to receive. What I keep returning to is the phrase, "The knowledge is not ours to take." This is not the language of people who were overpowered. It is not the language of people who were deceived or manipulated. It is not even the language of people who were frightened, though I have no way of knowing whether they were frightened. It is the language of people who made a judgment, a moral judgment, not a strategic or tactical one, about the nature of what they were doing, and who concluded, after whatever time they spent with the humans and with what the humans had built, that the judgment they had been operating under when they left home was wrong. The knowledge is not ours to take. What does a people have to be, for 4 different civilizations across 2 centuries to reach the same inability to take what they made? What does a thing have to be, for everyone who comes to claim it to either fail or choose, in the end, not to try? The Sorethian cooperative brought commercial leverage and a security escort, and encountered something that leverage and escorts could not resolve. The Kethavar Imperium brought 11 warships and encountered something that 11 warships were not adequate for. The Arvith consensus built genuine trust across 11 months of careful engagement, and then destroyed it on instruction, and sent 4 people to their ends with an apology. The Mevsathari Directorate sent 4 individuals to deceive, and was somehow seen through, and those individuals chose to stay rather than complete their mission. 4 different approaches, 4 different institutions, 4 different strategic cultures, 4 different assessments of what was needed and what would work. The same outcome, arrived at by different roads. I do not have an answer. I am not sure the question has one, or not one that fits in a bureau classification form. I open the 5th dossier. Acquisition Series 11, the most recent, 42 years ago, the Velhari Combined Sciences Consortium. My predecessor's name appears on the intake form. I have known for 9 years that this dossier was in the stack. I have known it was the reason she did not finish them. I did not think when I was assigned this subarchive that I would have to look at it directly. But here it is, and here I am, and the only thing left is to read it. The Velhari Combined Sciences Consortium was not a military structure and not a commercial governance structure. It was, as its name indicates, a research consortium, a coalition of Velhari scientific institutions that had pooled resources in order to pursue research programs too large or too complex for any single institution to manage alone. My predecessor was one of its affiliated historians, not a member of the expedition itself, but attached to the bureau at the time the expedition departed, and responsible for the initial intake of its file. The consortium sent an academic mission. 8 researchers across 4 vessels, small vessels, research class, carrying no weapons and no security personnel. The mission's stated purpose was not acquisition, it was documentation. They intended to study the human biotechnology from the outside, to observe, to analyze, to build as complete an academic record of the technology's external characteristics as they could assemble without direct access to the humans who made it, and to return with that record for the benefit of Velhari scientific literature. The consortium had concluded, reasonably, that the question of how to engage with the humans over this technology was one that could not be answered before better understanding the technology itself. They wanted to see it, not to take it, to see it. To understand, with scientific precision, what they were actually dealing with, so that future decisions about how to engage with it could be made on a real basis, rather than the accumulation of rumors and second-hand reports that had guided 4 previous expeditions to disaster. This reasoning is stated explicitly in the pre-departure documentation. It is careful, honest reasoning. The consortium acknowledges the history. It acknowledges that 4 previous expeditions by other parties had failed. It notes, with academic candor, that the record of those failures is itself interesting data, that the pattern of failure is uniform enough to suggest something systematic about the nature of the encounter, rather than something idiosyncratic about the methods of any particular expedition. It resolves not to repeat the errors of the others. The mission's first transmissions are extraordinary. I'm not saying this as a family member of anyone involved. I am saying this as a historian who has read a great many expedition transmissions. These transmissions are extraordinary. The consortium's researchers had reached the outer edge of the region and were conducting their documentation work at what they believed was a safe observational distance, and what they were observing had apparently exceeded every prior description in the intelligence record. The lead researcher's transmissions describe, across a sequence of messages spread over several weeks, a technology that was not experimental and not limited in scope. Entire settlement structures threaded through with living systems, vines and root architectures and filament networks that were simultaneously biological and structured with visible, precise energy patterning, medical facilities that were indistinguishable from gardens, bridges and load-bearing structures whose internal reinforcement grew and adapted visibly, the way a bone heals, over days. A communication relay network that, as far as the consortium's instruments could determine, was at least partly composed of living neural tissue operating in concert with conventional signal technology. The lead researcher spent an entire transmission simply describing the light. The color of it how the structured energy threaded through living systems produced a quality of illumination unlike anything in recorded observations, not the cold precision of hard light lattices and not the warm imprecision of biological luminescence, but something between them, something that the researcher said kept making her want to use words that were not scientific. Words like alive, words like breathing. The kind of words you use when you are looking at something that does not fit in the category you brought with you. This went on for 6 weeks. The consortium's researchers documented everything they could see from observational distance. They sent it all home in careful, detailed transmissions. They were doing exactly what they had set out to do. Then they tried to get closer. Not to engage the humans directly, not to make contact, only to improve their observational resolution, to move their instruments within range of a more precise reading of the energy-biology interface. A scientific decision made with scientific reasoning in pursuit of scientific data. The humans noticed. The last transmission from the lead researcher is also in the file. It is dated 3 days after the transmission about the light. It is not panicked. The lead researcher was not a person who panicked. I have read enough of her transmissions by now to know that. It is measured. It is honest. It says, "We have been approached by a human vessel, a small one. They have asked us to identify ourselves and explain our purpose. We have done so truthfully. We are waiting for their response. We believe we are safe. They have not indicated hostility. But we want the Bureau to have a record of this contact in case anything changes. We believe we are safe." The carrier wave continued for 40 minutes after the transmission ended. Then it stopped. My predecessor was the Bureau historian who logged the absence of further contact. She was the one who opened the inquiry. She ran it for 11 years, the entire remainder of her tenure at the Bureau, and produced nothing. No wreckage, no crew, no response from any human source to any query, official or unofficial, that the Bureau or the Velhari Combined Sciences Consortium sent in the years following. The human settlement the researchers had been observing was still there, according to subsequent navigational surveys conducted at considerable distance. The structures were still present, the energy biological systems still functioning. Whatever had happened did not involve the destruction of the settlement. It involved only the disappearance of 8 Velhari researchers and 4 vessels. My predecessor retired 11 years after opening the inquiry. She left the files in this subarchive, stacked neatly, bound with archival cord. She did not write a classification. I think now that she was protecting herself, that writing irrecoverable would have meant something too specific, too final, for someone who had spent 11 years trying to recover them and could not. I think she decided that not writing anything was easier than writing that. I understand this now in a way I did not when I was first assigned the subarchive. I have spent this entire long Thursday reading these 5 files, and I understand her better than I have ever understood anyone who held this position before me, and I am going to do what she could not do, which is write the word anyway. The Sorethian Cooperative's 3 ships, irrecoverable. The Kethavar Imperium's 11 warships, irrecoverable. The Arvith Consensus's 4 vessels, irrecoverable. The Mevsathari Directorate's 4 individuals, irrecoverable, with the notation that they chose this classification themselves and understood its meaning. The Velhari Combined Sciences Consortium's 8 researchers and 4 vessels, irrecoverable. I write the word on each form. I sign each one. The forms are physical. The Bureau uses physical signature for final classifications, a tradition that has persisted because physical signatures are harder to forge, and because there is a kind of accountability in the weight of a pen that digital authentication does not provide. I feel the weight of the pen on each form. Now I am sitting with all 5 forms signed and spread across my reading table, and the 5 dossiers stacked beside them, and I am thinking about what I know. What I know is this. Across 200 years, 5 separate powers sent expeditions to the same region of space to acquire, extract, negotiate for, observe, or simply understand a technology that human beings had developed. None of those expeditions returned in any conventional sense. 3 vanished without any comprehensible explanation, the ships present in one transmission and absent in the next, with no wreckage and no survivors at any subsequent date. One was discouraged by the humans in a way that convinced the Kethavar Imperium, an empire with a long history of not being discouraged, to quietly redraw their approach maps. One chose, in full knowledge of the consequences, not to return, leaving behind a transmission that I have read a dozen times tonight, and that I still cannot fully interpret. What I also know is that the Human Research Collective, or its descendants, or its institutional successors, or whatever form the ongoing work has taken across 2 centuries, is still there. The settlements are still there. The energy biological systems are still there, and from what the Velhari researchers documented before they went quiet, still growing, still adapting, still doing the thing that no other known civilization has managed to do, threading living matter and structured force together into something that the lead researcher could only describe with the word breathing. The galaxy has not sent a 6th expedition, not officially, not that has generated a file in this bureau. The Kethavar Imperium's approach zone notation has been, I know from my general awareness of current navigational charts, replicated in various forms by several other powers in the years since. Not formally, not through any announced treaty or coordination. Simply, the charts have been redrawn quietly by powers that have access to the same historical record I have been reading tonight, and the redrawn charts all carry some variant of the same small notation, some more explicit than others, some so oblique as to require professional training to read correctly. What they all say in one form or another is, vessels are not encouraged to approach. I have spent my career in this subarchive reading expedition files. I know how the Bureau thinks about risk. I know how the major galactic powers weigh strategic calculation against strategic caution. I know the long, complicated history of how civilizations decide which territories to approach and which to leave alone, and I know that the decision is almost never permanent, that the galaxy is not good at leaving things alone, and that even the most frightened empire eventually sends someone to look again. But the human biotechnology has been known, in outline, for over 200 years, and the 5th expedition was 42 years ago, and there has not been a 6th. I do not know whether this means the galaxy has finally learned something. I do not know whether it means the calculation has simply not tilted back in favor of another attempt yet. I do not know whether, in another 40 years, some governance structure I have not yet catalogued will decide that it is willing to try where the others failed, and will send its ships, and will generate a file that some future subarchive historian will read in a cold room with a lamp burning amber. I have spent enough time in this subarchive reading enough files to know that the galaxy is not, in the broad sweep of its history, good at restraint. It is not good at reading warnings. It is very good at deciding that the situation that destroyed others is different from its own situation, that it has something the others lacked, some advantage or understanding or quality of resolve that will make this time come out differently. Every expedition in these 5 dossiers believed some version of that. The Sorethian Cooperative believed it had commercial leverage. The Kethavar Imperium believed it had superior force. The Arvith Consensus believed it had superior patience. The Mevsathari Directorate believed it had superior intelligence and a superior plan. The Velhari Combined Sciences Consortium believed it had superior restraint, that merely observing, not engaging, not attempting to take anything, would protect it. Every one of them had something the others lacked. Every one of them was right that their approach was different from the others. Every one of them was wrong that being different would be enough. I think about this a great deal as I sit with the signed reclassification forms in front of me. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that I have seen in my 41 years at the Bureau, a failure of imagination about what a limit actually means. Institutions understand limits in terms of cost and capability. A limit is a place where the cost of proceeding exceeds the benefit, or where you lack the capability to proceed. These are the limits institutions are designed to assess and respond to. You raise the capability or you reassess the benefit, and you proceed differently or not at all. This is how institutions think. The 5 files in front of me describe a different kind of limit. They describe a place where the normal accounting does not apply, where superior force meets something force does not resolve, where superior patience builds something real and then destroys it on institutional instruction, where superior intelligence and planning encounters a people who see through it, and the response of those 4 individuals to being seen through is not to push harder or retreat in order or find another angle. It is to file a transmission with the Bureau and stay. That is not a limit you address by raising capability. That is not a limit you address by refining your approach. That is a limit of a different kind, and the galaxy's accumulated quiet redrawing of its navigational charts over 42 years suggests that enough people in enough positions of institutional authority have looked at these files, or their equivalents, and understood, even if they have not been able to say it clearly in the language their institutions use. This is not a problem we are going to solve by trying harder. What I know is that the thing the humans built has been trying to be taken for 2 centuries and has not been taken. That the people who built it have been trying to be understood and claimed and overwhelmed and deceived and studied, and have remained whatever they are through all of it. That an academic researcher from my own species, 42 years ago, observed a living structure grown through with light and reached for words outside her scientific vocabulary, and that the words she reached for were alive and breathing, and that 3 days later she was gone. I know that the Velhari team leader, the one who chose not to return, left a transmission for the Bureau that I have read 3 times tonight, and that the line I cannot stop thinking about is not the part about the knowledge not being theirs to take. It is the last sentence, not sorry for the choice. What kind of encounter produces that? What does a person see in the company of people who have built something that fuses the living and the luminous into a single practice? Not a weapon, not a strategic capability, not a tool of empire, but a practice, a way of working with life itself. What does a person see that makes them file a transmission addressed directly to the Bureau and then simply stay? I think the answer, if there is one, has something to do with the nature of what the humans made, not its utility, not its strategic value, though the strategic value is real and the 5 expeditions in these files are its testament, but its nature, what it is at its core. Every civilization that has attempted hard light architecture has built in one direction, away from life, precise, inert, fixed, controllable. The energy lattice does what you direct it to do and does not change after you stop directing it. This is the value of it, the predictability, the repeatability, the engineering clarity of a system that does not adapt, does not grow, does not have preferences. You can plan around a system that does not have preferences. The humans built something that has preferences. Not in a figurative sense. I do not mean they built a system that seems to make choices in an anthropomorphic way. I mean they built a system of living matter threaded through with structured energy that responds to the world the way living things respond. By growing toward what sustains it and away from what damages it, by healing when damaged, by adapting its structure over time in response to what it has encountered. They built, in effect, a kind of care, a technological embodiment of the principle that a thing which lives should be helped to live, and that the instrument of that help should itself be alive, should itself participate in the living it enables. And then they refused to let anyone take it. Not because they were strong enough to refuse, though apparently they were. Not because they were protected by force, though perhaps they were that too. But because the thing they built was not separable from the people who built it and the practice by which they built it, and every power that came to take it eventually encountered that inseparability and broke against it, or chose to stop. You cannot extract a practice. You cannot place a living methodology under institutional authority. You cannot own the philosophy of care. The galaxy's most powerful institutions sent their best approaches, force, leverage, patience, deception, restraint, and none of it was adequate to the task of acquiring something that was not, at its root, an object to be acquired. This is what the Velhari team leader understood when she filed her transmission to the Bureau. This is what the word irrecoverable actually means when I write it on these 5 forms. I do not have an answer. I am not going to find one tonight. I am not going to find one ever, because the people who could answer it did not come back, and the people who are still there, in the human settlement surrounded by structures that grow and heal and breathe with structured light, are not going to tell me. Not because they are hostile. That is the thing I have come to understand, sitting in this cold room for the last several hours. They are not hostile. Every file in this stack, read carefully, says the same thing in different ways. The humans are not hostile. The Kethavar commander said they were not what he believed them to be, not the expected target of 11 warships, not the expected object of an extraction order. The Arvith engagement specialist said they were watching, the way people watch who have been approached by force before. The Velhari team leader said the knowledge was not theirs to take. My predecessor's researchers said they believed they were safe. None of these sound like the language of people who encountered hostility. None of them sound like the language of people who were destroyed. They sound like the language of people who encountered something they could not integrate into the frameworks they brought with them, and who were then gone. The mechanism of the going unrecorded in every case. The mechanism of the going unrecorded. 5 expeditions across 200 years. The galaxy's most powerful institutions, its most sophisticated researchers, its most careful diplomats, and its most dedicated intelligence services. And in every case, a last transmission and then silence, and then nothing the Bureau has ever found. The humans built something that breathes, and they are still there. And everyone who came to take it, or to study it, or to understand it, either stopped transmitting or chose not to return. And the galaxy, very quietly, has redrawn its charts. I stack the 5 dossiers. I place the 5 signed reclassification forms on top of them. I turn off my secondary lamp, and the circle of amber on my reading table goes dark. I will submit the forms in the morning. I will write a cover letter to the Oversight Council explaining that Acquisition Series 7 through 11 have been formally classified as irrecoverable, and that the inquiry is closed. I will recommend, in language carefully calibrated to be clear without being alarmist, that no further acquisitions in this sector should be authorized. I will not explain why beyond what the files already say. The files say enough. The files say in the aggregate everything that needs to be said. I will put on my coat and take the maintenance stairs up to the ground level and step out into the night air, which is cold and clear and smells of the city rather than of old document cord and ventilation malfunction. I will walk home. I will sleep, I hope, though I am not certain I will. And the 5 dossiers will sit in this subarchive with their reclassification forms on top of them, formally closed, irrecoverable. The humans still there, in their living settlements threaded through with light, doing whatever it is they have always been doing, building something the galaxy does not have a category for, refusing to be claimed, remaining exactly what they are through 2 centuries of the galaxy's attempts to decide what to do with them. I put on my coat. I leave the lamp dark. I do not look back at the stack.